I'm rewatching Outlander from the beginning. Let's talk about one of my favorite scenes between Claire and Jamie from season 1, episode 5, titled Rent. As always, I'm a book reader, so if you are looking to avoid spoilers from the books or the TV show, please do keep on scrolling. So one of the most beautiful scene adaptations from the books and the original source material is this one here between Jamie and Claire during the episode Rent, when Jamie is sleeping outside of her door. Now, if you have the books or haven't read the books yet, this scene takes place in chapter 12, titled The Garrison Commander. Be sure to go back and read that chapter if you want to see how it originally played out, because even though the basic premise of the scene is the same in both formats, it is quite different from the book version of events. Because in the books, I find that Claire recounts this interaction with more of a tone of amusement, I would argue. She focuses more on the absurdity of the situation rather than recounting any real deep feelings felt between her and Jamie. She also is describing what's happening and omits any body language or her, feelings or reactions to him in any way that might imply that she's attracted to him. And instead, their interaction is marked more so by banter that we come to know and love between the two of them, and her irritation with the situation. She's also grateful for him being kind and thinking of her in the way that he does. Concern for her safety, she appreciates, but there is an underlining implication of him caring for her, yes, but her narration really doesn't dwell on any physical tension or romantic subtext of any sort. Whereas in the show, I would argue there's a much different approach by visually conveying their growing attraction towards one another. I do want to read you an excerpt just to give you kind of an example of what I'm talking about. So one passage, it says, "Seeing that he couldn't be persuaded, I insisted that he at least take the blankets from my bed to lie upon. He agreed to this reluctantly, and only upon my repeated assurances that I would not use them myself in any case, but intended to sleep as usual in the cover of my thick traveling coat." So Claire is very blunt. She doesn't add any subtext to any of this at all. In the show, Jamie has much softer body language. Their physical closeness, it lingers longer. You can see him peeking into the door to see how she is staying in this room. He has just like this adoration in his eyes when he looks at her. And the scene plays out with a lot more overt romantic attraction between the two of them. And yes, it's still humorous, and she laughs because she steps on him and he makes a joke that kind of eases her tension a little bit. But it's more charged with this like physical awareness of one another, and it highlights this unspoken chemistry between them that they surely can feel, and something that we see time and time again. I had mentioned in previous episode rewatches that Sam Heughan established early on this particular facial expression and softness of his eyes that he does every time he looks at Claire, and it looks like he's in love. And he does that over and over and over again. And so as viewers, we subconsciously recognize that when he makes that expression, facial expression, we know what he's thinking. And he does it again here. He has that same look of adoration in his eyes in the scene. And Claire is starting to do the same thing too. We're starting to pick up at this point on her subtle cues and her specific looks that she gives to Jamie that imply her feelings as well. I really found Jamie to be quite charming in this episode because the two of them continue to grow their trust with one another. He goes out of his way to make sure that she feels included. He teaches her very subtly how to fit in amongst the men, but he also does right by her in ways that I think in the book Claire, again, is very oblivious to. In the show, she certainly is to a certain extent, but she's not oblivious to this spark between them. Something that the books really doesn't have Claire tell us as readers. Her internal dialogue with herself and her internal monologue really doesn't give much away about how she feels about Jamie. But I think the show is smart to have all of these subtle nuances, because I like to imagine that book Claire doesn't want us to know how she feels. Probably because she's trying to convince herself that she still is trying to get back to Frank and loves Frank, and she's very focused on Frank and her relationship with him. and is trying to push those feelings towards Jamie away. And so in the books, she, doesn't share them with us because she's probably not focused on them, trying to avoid them. But the show makes it pretty clear that she can't avoid them. And we're also trying to fall in love with Jamie through Claire because, again, even though the medium is different, we are in Claire's POV in the show too. Every scene that we see is from Claire's POV. We really don't have any scenes without her being the central focus of the scene. And so if Claire's falling in love with Jamie, then we as viewers are falling in love with Jamie. And if Claire is being oblivious to how much Jamie loves her, we are then rooting for her to figure it out. So as viewers, we become more invested with this sort of decision-making and tactic that the show chooses to employ here. The line where he says, "I'll be right here," is taken directly from the text, but again, he delivers it with a deeper voice, and he touches her fingers, and they linger there for a second. All of that is not something that we see in the story in the books. In fact, in the books, Jamie's character kind of plays off that his motivations aren't entirely out of the kindness of his heart to sleep outside of Claire's room. He's also trying to avoid being seen by the British that are downstairs in the bar room. So again, that kind of removes the romance that the scene in the show builds up. So there's definitely a different approach to this scene in the story from the books versus the story from the show. But I personally really loved the portrayal of it in the show because it was just beautifully acted, very romantic, and again, makes us invested in this relationship coming to fruition.